the newcomers. If you are interested in this program and want to be part of it, please drop me a line. I'm happy to add you to our list, to the regulars. Welcome back. We're delighted to have Ben Yee with us again tonight. And if you're new to Zoom, which by now all of us are pretty much tired of it, but anyway, if you're new to Zoom, the etiquette is in large groups to stay muted, and you can speak to us either through the chat or with the participant section, raise like an electronic raising hand, and I will try to monitor both and call on you as time allows. If you have any questions about that, just feel free to put it in the chat. We'll explain it to you. Okay, so for those of you who don't know me, my name is Ida Masana. I'm a primary care physician in Forest Hills, Queens for more than 20 years. Let's Talk Democracy is a grassroots organization dedicated to educating people about our government, encouraging dialogue about the basic foundations of our democracy, and empowering citizens to make their voices heard. We've been providing classes and forums and seminars and book club discussions at the Forest Hills Library since 2017. But now that we are on Zoom, we are grateful to Donna for sharing her Zoom account with us once again tonight. We're very grateful to have Ben Yee with us to walk us through the upcoming primaries in New York City, and in particular the ranked choice voting, which is a new method of voting that we will be, I guess, using for the first time in a large scale. So we're interested in knowing about that. It's time to select a new mayor, and this mayor will have the responsibility of walking us through the aftermath of the coronavirus catastrophe. And 2/3 of the city council seats are up for grabs as well. So Monica Klein, a political consultant, said, "We're at a rare moment when the vast majority of council members will be replaced all at once. And right now, the field of council candidates is radically, economically, and generationally diverse. There are more women running for office. People are running for office at a younger age. And there are more people of color, immigrants, and children of immigrants, and socioeconomically diverse candidates in the field. June 22nd is the day, primary day, so mark your calendars. In addition, for the first time, we will use a new method of voting called ranked choice voting. Instead of choosing just one candidate, we've got to rank them with our 5 favorites in order of preference. You've heard a lot about it, but is it better? And how will it really work? Ben Yee will walk us through it all tonight as an insider. He is the state councilman for New York's 5th Assembly District and secretary of the Manhattan Democratic Party. He is a community organizer, a huge proponent of transparency in government, ethics reform, and better politics through empowering people. Many of you still remember him as a very knowledgeable and engaging speaker who has participated in our programs in the past, making complicated topics more understandable. We want this event to be interactive, so we will be monitoring the chat, as I mentioned, and the raise hand section in the participants. So stay muted until called on. We do hope to address all your questions and comments, but of course, we remind you, in order to create a safe space and an opportunity for everyone to share, please remember our rules of engagement, be respectful of others and their point of view, raise your hand, and wait to be recognized. 2-minute limit, keep comments short and focused, don't interrupt, avoid making generalizations or assumptions, use I statements and speak from your own experience, and no personal attacks. And with that, I will turn the screen over to Ben Yee.
Fantastic, thanks so much. So I'm going to share my screen. I've got a presentation put together. Because some of these topics can be quite complex without visuals. But we're going to cover 2 things today. One is New York City government. So basically, all of the people who are up for election this year and what it is that they actually do, so that folks can have a sense of what's at stake. Then we'll dive into the ranked choice voting and the actual mechanics of that, so that people can truly feel confident that they get exactly how this thing's going to go down and then vote accordingly. So first things first, if anybody has questions after the fact, you can always reach me through these channels on Twitter, YBen, on Facebook, and by email. So that's my contact information. Please feel free, if I don't answer a question tonight for some reason, to get in touch. I always love, though, when people hit me up on Twitter in particular, because then my responses are public and that information can be used to help other people as well. So Ida, already introduced me, but just to say a little bit about myself, I just want to clarify, I am the state committeeman for the 66th Assembly District in Manhattan. And what that means is I represent that district to the state Democratic Party. Now, if you're not familiar with how the Democratic Party is structured and all that, that's a whole other talk that I'm happy to do at another time. But just know that the Democratic Party has elected leadership, and you have a right to vote for the leaders in the political party in which you are registered. But without spending too much time on that, because again, I could really go on for hours on that topic, let's just talk about our representation here in New York City. So New York is unique in all of the United States of America in that we have a pretty streamlined government. There's only 4 levels of governance really for New York: the nation, which is the United States of America, the state, which is New York, and the city, which is also New York. Then we happen to have counties inside of the city. These are the 5 boroughs. They don't really have their own separate governments. I only mention them because historically they used to be powerful, and we just are familiar with them as New Yorkers. But the only governance that we really experience are the nation, the state, and the city. So that's really 3 levels of government. Now, I just want to contrast this for a moment with the rest of the country. The rest of the country can have a much more complex structure, which New York City used to share, but has streamlined over time. So if you go somewhere else, say Long Island or just north of the Bronx, you'll have many more levels of government. You'll have the nation, which is governed by the federal government. You'll have the state government again. You'll have counties, which are the universal unit of local governance in the United States. So wherever you go, you have counties. And then inside of counties, you have towns, villages, hamlets, etc., all of you municipal government. And then sometimes crisscrossing all of these other lines are your special districts. And special districts are just districts that provide a single special service. So school boards, water boards, dog catchers, sheriffs, highway superintendents, all of those things are special districts. They simply provide one particular type of service. But at every level of government, you have elections and you have taxes. So New York City is, again, very streamlined and simple in this regard. You can just imagine how many elected officials you have to keep track of if you have multiple special districts and you live in a town that's also in a county, which is inside of a state, which is inside of the federal government. In New York City, just by way of example, we used to have education boards, and that was only abolished under Michael Bloomberg. It's fairly recent that we have mayoral control of schools. And the reason we got rid of education boards is because nobody voted in them. They were at an odd time of the year, and only 2% of people turned up to vote on how education money should be spent. So we simply scrapped them. And that's sort of how New York has been moving over time, to a more centralized government. So again, every place exists in the nation. Every place exists inside of a state in this country. Then you've got your various counties at other places, but New York City is the only place in this country where multiple counties have been fused into a single municipality. So we have 5 counties that became one city. That's, of course, Queens, New York County, which is Manhattan, Richmond County, Staten Island, the Bronx, and Kings County, which is Brooklyn. This is unique in all of the places in America. Then again, inside of counties, you have your towns, your cities, and your villages. And then we pop back down, and New York does have counties, but they do nothing. So from an outsider looking in, New York is just strange as all get out. And we don't have any special districts anymore. So what do all of these governments do, particularly, the nation, the state, and the city in this regard? Well, the first thing to know about governments is that The Constitution empowers and protects the state and federal governments. They're written in to the Constitution. Those are the only real forms of government that have concrete powers in this country. All other power is delegated. And this is really important to understand. The state controls everything, and as a technical matter, New York City controls nothing unless the state lets it control, right? So you might remember that New York City tried to pass a plastic ban law, and it actually passed the city council and was signed by the mayor. And then Albany got its hands on it, and Andrew Cuomo said, I don't like this law, and had the legislature effectively veto it. So we did not get a plastic bag ban. Then a few months later, Andrew Cuomo said, I have a great idea. Let's ban plastic bags in New York City, or put a 5-cent tax on them, and then pass the law as if it was his own. And the state can do this because technically every single rule, every single law, every single thing that New York City wants to do can be overridden by the state government. So that being said, obviously New York City government does do some things, and this is because of something known as home rule. The home rule, community is one that's constantly active. It's always there at a low level of people who want New York City to have more control over its own affairs. For example, the state retains critical control over so many fundamental issues, such as ultimate decision-making on legislation, transportation, it runs the MTA, housing, it decides all of our housing policies, all of our housing laws, with the exception of zoning, and it controls all of our taxes except for real estate tax. So the city, for example, can't raise an income tax on anybody, right? It basically only has control of real estate taxes, which is why funding for the city, is such a difficult thing to come by. New York City, however, does get local control over policing, so it controls the NYPD, land use and zoning, which is to say what gets built where, education, largely, and then basic services like sanitation, sewers, and what have you. So that being said, when we talk about what these New York City primaries are about and what these elected officials do, it's going to be in this right-hand bucket. Now, just as an aside, of all of those issues, the biggest one is probably zoning. And for those who don't know, I just want to clarify what zoning is. Zoning is the setting of allowed uses for land and building regulations, right? It's all about what you're allowed to build in a specific part of the city. So whether it's residential or whether it's commercial, whether it's 10 feet tall or 500 feet tall, right? These are all things that have to do with zoning. It's one of the most important and money-driven aspects of New York City politics, because obviously the real estate, the land value in New York City is so high. So let's talk about the representation that we have here in New York City, and then we'll get more and more granular as we move on. First, of course, we have federal representation. This is the one that most people are familiar with. We have the president, who's elected by the country as a whole, ish, depending on how you view the Electoral College. We have 2 senators. Every state gets 2. We have 2 of them. Although, again, it's a bit unfair when Wyoming has 500,000 people and gets 2 senators, and New York has 20 million people and gets 2 senators. But that sort of balances out with the Congress. For every 700,000 residents, actually, yeah, so every 700,000 residents, you get 1 member in the House of Representatives. And this is residents, not citizens. So overall population counts, which is why, Republicans were trying to do all sorts of funny things about the census not too long ago. Now, that's the federal government, and it takes care of the national affairs. We also have a state government. We have a governor, a comptroller, and an attorney general. All of these folks are elected statewide, so by the state as a whole. The governor is the one with which most people are familiar. They're the chief executive, sort of like the president. The comptroller is the treasurer. And we'll get into what controllers do a little bit later on, so hold on to that idea. Then we have an attorney general. Attorney general is basically the chief law enforcement officer for state laws. Underneath that, we have district attorneys. Now, this is a bit of an oddity. District attorneys are elected at the county level, and they're elected at the same time as our city government, but they are in fact state elections. This is going to matter later on when we talk about matching funds, because district attorneys are not eligible for any of the advantages of running for city office, but they operate within the city and they are the chief law enforcement officer for city laws. And, for all law enforcement basically in the city. Then you have state senators. There's one of these for every 330,000 people. And then we have state assembly members, and there's one of those for basically every 140,000 people. But that's the state. And then finally, we come down to the city. And we have a lot of representation in the city. We have a mayor who's elected by the city as a whole. That's our chief executive. We also have a controller, again, the treasurer, who's elected by the city. And we have the public advocate. And again, we're going to get into what all these people do and their official powers. Then we also have borough presidents. There's one for every borough, and city council members. Each city council member represents about 160, 170,000 people. And that's pretty much it for a single New Yorker's representation at every level of government, with the exception of one item, which is judges. Now, we are not going to talk about judges today. Judges, however, are up for election this year at some levels of the judiciary, but judicial elections and that selection process can be very, very complicated. So if people want to go into it after the rest of the talk, I'm happy to do so, but we're not going to cover judges. We're going to cover city government. And while judges are technically part of city government and they are elected, they are outside of what most people think of as like the legislative process. So before I go on, any questions on anything I've said so far? Because we're about to go nitty gritty into New York City representation, like city elections.
I think you can go on, Ben. I don't see any questions in the chat, and I don't see any hand raised.
All right, we're good to
Go
go. It only gets more interesting from here. So that was some pretty basic stuff. Let's just talk about the city. We're going to recap for a moment. Let's just remember, citywide, we have a mayor, controller, and public advocate. Everybody votes. All votes are counted across the city. Borough presidents and district attorneys are up for election this year. They're elected at the county level, so by borough. And then city council district, there's 51 members in the city council. They're all up for election. So all of these people on this screen are facing elections in 2021. Now, what happens in the primary is really important. And that is because almost everybody's a Democrat. 100% of our citywide electeds are Democrat. 90% of our county electeds are Democrat. And 96% of our city council is Democrat. So this probably tells you something about how critically important the Democratic primary is. If you win the Democratic primary, your odds of winning your general election are basically 90% and up. Just for those who are curious, it's not a lock because Staten Island exists. All right, let's talk about the mayor. We're going to go through each one of these folks in sequence and talk about the powers that they have and what they do for the people of New York. The mayor, we have what's known as a strong mayor system here in New York City. So the mayor literally does everything. So we're going to come back. It's easier to define what the mayor doesn't do than what the mayor does do. They have power over almost every single aspect of government. So let's talk about the controller. I mentioned the controller is effectively the treasurer. What does that really mean? To some degree, it means they don't have a lot of power, right? Technically, they're responsible for signing all of the contracts of the city. So when the city council votes to spend money on something in the budget, and the mayor negotiates a deal with the union and has to pay out those paychecks, or with a third-party vendor and has to pay out that paycheck, the controller signs that contract and they sign that check. But technically, they don't have a choice. There have been moments in history when controllers have refused to sign a contract or a check, preventing the payment in exchange for goods and services. But if you ended up going to court over that because of a failure to pay, they would be forced to sign it in the end. It really is just a delayment of payment. They do, however, have the power to audit agencies, and controllers for the last several years have been really into the idea of writing reports about the financial future of New York and of audits of agencies. So Tom DiNapoli, for example, at the state level, he's the comptroller for New York State. He does a lot of that sort of stuff, and he does a lot of investigations and audits into state agencies. John Liu, who you might remember, he's a state senator out in Queens, and was comptroller before that. He was most well known for doing an audit of the payroll system of New York City, and he found a huge scandal called the City Time scandal, where the automatic hour logging for city employees was being gamed and people were getting extra money. And then finally, the comptroller does have one consistent, powerful role, and that is to sit on the pension investment boards. The comptroller has a big voice in where the pension money for New York City is invested. So all of those union folks who are getting pensions, all of those city employees who are getting pensions, the money that they're saving, that the city will pay out to them in retirement, has to be invested somewhere. It's billions, billions of dollars. And that means that New York City, by moving its money, can actually influence corporate decision-making. Because if it moves its money all at once, it will hurt the stock price for the companies that it leaves. So there have been pressure campaigns to have the comptroller, for example, move the money away from fossil fuels, move the money away from gun companies. And in fact, we are no longer invested as a city in, or as a state, I think, in gun manufacturers. The public advocate. What is now? Public advocate's a position near and dear to my heart. I ran for this once upon a time. I know exactly what it's all about. First thing about the public advocate is it is first in the line of succession to the mayor. It's basically the vice president of New York City. There's never been a succession of public advocate to the position of mayor, but it is that. And then it also has a budget. But believe me when I tell you, it is the vice president of New York City in so many ways, because in the same vein that we would think of the vice president of not doing anything in particular, so too with the public advocate. They have no real powers or abilities, but they have a mandate to be antagonistic to the mayor. So unlike the vice president, they are independently elected with the purpose of holding the mayor accountable and doing audits into city agencies. Not dissimilar from the comptroller, but the big difference is the public advocate has a smaller budget and cannot subpoena. It has no subpoena power. So much of what the public advocate ends up doing is running programs with its budget, giving out money to nonprofits and third-party organizations, and raising awareness and generating press about issues that might be important, that are of importance to New Yorkers. Now, the borough presidents. The borough presidents are like mini public advocates. And the reason they exist is because they're a vestigial organ of the county governments. A long time ago, before New York City was one city, the 5 counties were independent. And each county had to have a county executive, the person who ran the county, kind of like the mayor of Brooklyn. And there's probably people who run around saying they're the mayor of Brooklyn, but they're not really. The borough president's the theoretical mayor of Brooklyn, but they've been stripped of all their powers. And there's a long history for why they've lost all their power. But there's a Supreme Court case about it. Happy to explain it if folks are interested. Ultimately, though, because they've been stripped of most of their power, very much like the public advocate, the vast majority of what they come with is a budget which they can use to support community projects and community groups and nonprofits. They also get to have official opinions. Now, I don't mean this in a snarky way. The borough president is the head of something known as the borough board. And the borough board advises all of the community boards and brings together all the community boards. And as part of that role, the borough president has an official voice in the land use zoning process that we were just talking about earlier. So if you don't like the big hotel going up next to your house, or you don't like the waste transfer station or the homeless shelter coming to your neighborhood, the borough president has a role in saying whether or not they think that should be allowed. However, it's only advisory, so it is literally an official opinion, not an official power. And then, I didn't mention this for the public advocate, but it's true. Both of these offices have the power to introduce legislation into the city council. but they have no vote. And as a result, they have very little that they can trade for city council members to vote on things. That being said, they can write legislation and introduce it. The district attorney. Now remember, the district attorney is not a city office. This is a state office. But what do? They basically handle legal for all the crimes committed within a county. So you go to Queens, or like I go to Queens, I guess you live in Queens. I come to Queens and I commit a crime. Well, if I go back to Manhattan, because the crime was committed in Queens, the police pick me up and the Queens DA decides whether or not to prosecute me. So if I jump a turnstile in Queens, the Queens DA decides whether or not I should go to trial for that, whether I should be fined for that, or whether they want to put me in jail for that. And it really matters who your DA is. They decide which crimes and which cases to prosecute. So for example, I bring this up because if I go to Queens and I jump the turnstile, I'm getting prosecuted. In Manhattan, our DA has said they're not prosecuting any fare jumping cases, which means that if I jump the turnstile in Manhattan, because I did in Manhattan, even if the police pick me up, DA is going to let me walk, right? So this person is wildly powerful and has come into the spotlight because of a lot of the concerns that are arising around criminal justice. You might be familiar with the Tiffany Caban race against, well, I guess there were a lot of people, but ultimately, great, now I can't remember who won. Balls. But
Melinda Katz.
Melinda Katz, right. And the whole point there was that Tiffany Caban's race or her candidacy was really about promising not to prosecute a host of crimes that she deemed unnecessary to arrest people for. And this is an attempt at instating criminal justice when you can't change the laws or the police department. And now we come to the big enchilada, the city council. Now, in New York City, we only have one level of the legislature. There is no Senate and Assembly. There is no Senate and House. There is only the 51 people of the city council. What do? Well, they're not quite as powerful as the House and the in the federal government. As I said, we have a strong mayor system. They get to approve the budget. Technically, they pass it, but the mayor writes the budget and sends it to the city council for approval. The city council does not get to propose the first draft of the budget to which the mayor responds. It is the opposite direction, which is one of the reasons the mayor has so much control. They also pass laws and regulations, such as whether or not this, actually, we don't even control the speed limit now that I think about it. Yeah, so they pass things like curbside pickup and like what's gonna happen when you park on the wrong side of the street. They also control zoning. So this is one of their big powers, which they'll use occasionally, which is, let's say that there's a zoning process and there's a big hotel going up next to your house. Well, it looks like it's gonna happen. It looks like it's gonna happen, but you can get your city council member to fight it. The city council has the option, but not the obligation, to review all zoning matters. And then they approve some, but not many, mayoral appointments. The city attorney being the big one. Probably somebody you've not heard of. And then lastly, I just want to mention the city council member. Individually, city council members do have things that they can do and accomplish all on their own. Very much like borough presidents and public advocates, they get discretionary funds. Now, a lot of these city council members, not a lot, some, a handful, use participatory budgeting. That allows them to take the money that they get from the government, and then they let people vote on how that should be spent in the community. Fixing roads, potholes, buying supplies for schools. These are all things that city council members do with or without the input of their community, but they can buy these things. They also provide constituent services. What are those? If you have a problem that requires the government's attention, you can call up your city council member and they're there to help you navigate the various city agencies and find the right person to solve the problem that you have. In many cases, they might also be able to put you in touch with third-party nonprofit organizations that help with things like food insecurity, housing, homelessness, legal support for tenants, any number of things. And then, as mentioned, the city council as a whole can take up a zoning matter because of something called member deference, individual city council members can deeply, deeply influence what happens in their district. Basically, what happens is the whole city council votes, but they all vote in support of whatever a council member wants. And the reason is all the other members want the exact same opportunity when something happens in their neighborhood, right? So a city council member can theoretically veto any zoning situation. And zoning, by the way, includes not just how tall a building can be in your area, but also whether there'll be a new school, whether there'll be a historic district, whether there'll be a homeless shelter, whether there'll be a waste transfer station or a landfill. All of these things fall under zoning. Now, the last thing, would it be incomplete of me to talk about city government without mentioning community boards, which everybody always asks about. What do community boards do? Well, community boards review zoning and building plans, but they just review them. They provide an official community position on zoning plans and on anything else that might impact the community. So this might be a change in school policy. It might be a change in sanitation and in like the hours that garbage trucks come by. But these are all simply advisory. A community board has no official power to change anything, but if an elected official cares about popular opinion, they may or may not view the community board as an extension of that popular opinion. What we can say about community boards for sure is that while they're not elected, they are in theory there to represent the interests of people who actually live in a particular area. Now, we'll revisit the mayor at the end. The mayor has most of the power. They propose the city budget. Basically, they write the budget, they give it to the city council, and the city council has a limited time to come up with a response. Failure to do so means they'll probably pass the mayor's budget, and it gives the mayor tremendous initiative in negotiations because they set the bar. They also negotiate all city contracts with third-party vendors, with corporations, with unions. They also control most of the land use process, and they have all of the sweet parts. We'll see that in just a moment. And then finally, it appoints all city agency heads and non-civil servant positions. So any political appointee in city government that doesn't work in a city council member's office or another elected official's office comes from the mayor. Tremendous opportunity to employ friends and reward allies. But such is the way. Now, the last thing I want to talk about city government is ULUR, which is the Uniform Land Review, the Uniform Land Use Review process. This is how zoning happens. And again, I've mentioned zoning several times. I just want to drive home how important zoning is. It is the biggest, most corrupting influence in New York City because real estate developers are one of the largest donors to candidates, both at the city level and at the state level. In fact, they used to basically run New York State. It's why we don't have affordable housing rules, because they basically bought and paid for the state Republican Party, and all of their money, and I'm talking hundreds of millions every year, went to secure Republican control of the Senate. Donald Trump, for example, is a perfect example of New York politics because he comes from New York City real estate. All of those backroom deals are done with real estate developers and politicians to decide on zoning. There is so much money tied up in land in New York City. So this is the process by which we decide how to use that land. There's a 30-day early warning period, right? In which the city tells community boards, hey, there's a change coming. That's nice, I suppose. Then city planning, after those 30 days are up, will actually certify an application and kick off the ULURP process. So again, this early warning is just like city planning is required to tell a community board, guess what, we're going to certify something in 30 days. It's a little extra time to review, I suppose. Once that certification happens, the community board has another 60 days to look at that plan and come up with a response. Once that response is generated, it goes to the borough president for review and approval. And again, the borough president gets to say, I like this plan, I don't like this plan. And then that review from the community board and the borough president goes to the city planning commission. Now, the city planning commission is not advisory. The city planning commission can kill or allow a deal to go forward. And then finally, in step 5, maybe the city council takes up the matter. They have 50 days to do that. If they don't, the plan just goes ahead with what city planning commission said. And then very rarely the mayor will step in, and this only happens, all they can do is veto. They can't propose changes or do anything that alters the plan, but they can veto a plan if they really want. Very rarely happens. And the reason is, here are all the steps the mayor controls in yellow. They control the city planning, which is a required step for certification. They require the city plan, they control the city planning commission, which is a required step for moving the application to development. And they control the veto process. So of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 steps, all 3 out of 4 of which are actually decision-making, the mayor controls 3. And that is why the mayor is one of the single most powerful person in the city. If you discount, I guess, the governor and the president of the United States. Or if you believe that billionaires are more powerful than politicians, but as far as elected officials go, mayor's where it's at. So I'm going to pause here and ask if there's any questions on anything I've said or comments, because after this, we're going into elections. We're going to talk about ranked choice and all that good stuff.
Ben, I don't see any questions, and I know people are here for the elections and ranked choice voting, so go for it.
Here we go. So now that we know who everybody who's going to be elected and exactly what it is that they do in our city, let's talk about how they get there and the importance of the rules that govern that process. So, as mentioned, 90% plus of our elected officials are Democrats. That means that the political party of the Democratic Party has a lot of power. And this is because running for office is hard. Parties, make it easy to raise money. They provide expertise and networks to candidates. They have access to voters and party members. And then perhaps most importantly, at least in New York City, they provide name recognition and branding. If you call somebody up and say, who are you voting for? They'll probably tell you the Democrat. They might not know who the Democrat is, but they'll probably tell you the Democrat. Now, this is kind of a problem because it goes all the way back to Tammany Hall. There's a humongous opportunity for corruption. When people look at the party and just decide, I'm going to vote for the party, and they don't look at the people, you just get perpetuation of power based on who runs that party. So if folks are familiar with Tammany Hall, you might remember, I don't think anybody was alive for Tammany Hall. Oh, there are people who tell me every time I talk, Tammany Hall still exists. Tammany Hall is the Democratic Party of the early 1900s. They ran a tremendously corrupt patronage machine where all city money was directed to Friends of Tammany. This lovely picture here is the Tammany tiger, which was actually the symbol of the Democratic Party. Somewhere along the line, we turned into donkeys, but we used to be tigers, for real. It was the blue tiger. And this is a picture of Tammany, the Democratic Party, killing democracy. That fine young woman here being mauled is democracy. So it was not a good scene. In the 1900s, a bunch of reforms were passed to break the power of the party bosses. And the number one reform was the primary. So if you can imagine, there was a world in which primaries didn't exist, but Democrats always won. So who decided the Democratic candidate? The party bosses. The reformers realized they couldn't beat the Democrats in an election. They tried to run as Republicans. They tried to run as independents. It didn't work. So they finally got upstate Republicans to pass a law that would create primaries, which enabled them to compete inside of the Democratic Party for the Democratic Party line. And this finally gave people a way into Tammany. And this actually, when I was mentioning before, this is what led to the elected leadership of the Democratic Party. So when I mentioned that structure, the Democratic Party is broken into 3 levels: a national committee, so that's the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, a state committee, and a county committee. And here in New York City, that county committee is at every borough, right? So every county, every borough has its own Democratic Party. At the county and state level, Democratic voters in the primary choose who their elected representatives will be. So you vote for county committee members at the county level, and you vote for state committees at the state committee level, at the state level. So when I said I'm a state committee member, this is me. I live at this level of the Democratic Party. When I just said I was secretary of the Manhattan Democratic Party, that means an elected leadership position at this level, the county level of the Democratic Party. So this is how the control of special interests has been broken over time in New York City. And there's one last key reform, which is unique to New York, and that's matching funds. So the last thing to keep in your head as we jump into the ranked choice mechanics is that money is much less of a question in New York City, because for every dollar that you give a qualifying candidate, they get $8 from the city. So if you give a candidate $10, they get 90 overall, 10 from you, 80 from the government. If you give them $100, they get 900 overall, 100 from you, 900 from the government. And in order to receive these matching funds, candidates have to accept limits on how much they'll raise and spend for their election, right? So this means that most candidates will have exactly the same amount of money. The exceptions are very, very wealthy people. Bloomberg, notoriously, for his last election, did not use matching funds and spent $100 million of his own money. So it's not that money isn't consequential at all, but for many, many races, it will not be a real factor, right? Everybody will have the same amount of money. So let's talk about voting. Let's talk about ranked choice voting and how this really makes a difference, and how those candidates will spend their money for sure, but how the difference is made now in the electoral process, no longer in the party politics or in the financing of elections, because those matters have largely been dealt with by reforms over the last 100 years. All right, ranked choice voting came into effect in 2019. You might remember that we had a referendum on whether or not we should change our election rules, along with a couple of other things. So this was the proposed change to the city charter. In particular, what it allows is the ranking of up to 5 candidates in a primary and special election for city offices. Now, this is really important. This only applies to primaries, right? You will hear arguments about how ranked choice voting weakens the 2-party system. This will not be the case in New York City. Democrats will continue to win. It's who becomes the Democrat that is affected by ranked choice voting. I just want to make that absolutely clear. And you get to rank up to 5 people. So a lot of races this year have maybe like 10 or 11 people. You'll rank up to 5. The other component is that the way we count our votes is what's known as instant runoff voting. The last place candidate will be eliminated, and any candidate who was eliminated will have their votes transferred to second choice candidates of their voters. We'll get into that in just a moment. But this basically sets forth New York City will have an instant runoff style. There are many ways to count ranked votes. This is just one of them. And then finally, the theoretical reason or rationale for putting this in the charter is that it will eliminate the runoff primary elections for mayor, public advocate, and comptroller. So actually in New York City, we already have runoff elections. They're just not instant runoff elections, and they don't exist for city council. But if you are a mayoral candidate and you're in a race and nobody in that race gets above 40% of the vote in the primary, there is a runoff. So this was almost the case for Bill de Blasio. He got 41% of the vote in 2013 in the Democratic primary. We almost had a runoff between him and Bill Thompson. Now, again, just to stress this, primaries apply to everybody, but this will only apply to the primary. which means that our multi-party system, it won't make third parties a big thing, right? It will still maintain the same party dynamic. This is happening internal to the party. Okay, so let's get into it. What is all of this to a voter? Well, let's say we have a voter, Victoria voter. Let's tell a little election story. Under the old rules, we might have an election for District 3. It's an arbitrary number, could be the district you live in. There are 4 candidates running in that district. Now, again, we have races with 11, 13 candidates. We're going to simplify this and just bring it down to 4 for the moment. Under the old rules, well, actually, you know what? We'll get that in a second. Under the old rules, Victoria voter has to choose one candidate. Let's say she picks candidate A. Candidate B can win this election with less than 50% of the vote. Right now, New York City operates, well, not right now, previously, New York City operated on what's known as first past the post voting. That means that whoever gets the most votes wins. That might sound intuitive, but it actually doesn't result in a majoritarian system. It doesn't result in a system where the majority of people are happy. And that is because when you have 4 candidates running, as long as everybody gets a little bit of the vote, you can have somebody winning with less than 50%. Our voter is dismayed. But I really want to point out, the winning candidate had 5 votes. The losing candidates put together had 9 votes. The majority of people in this district are unhappy with the person who won. Ranked choice voting is supposed to solve that problem so that the majority of people are happy with the person who won. So, what do? You have a few options. You could accept minority rule. That's what New York City has done for hundreds of years. You could do what Donald Trump wanted to do when he got a minority of votes and declare martial law and just stay in office forever. You could have a top 2 runoff. This is what New York City has been doing for the last dozen years or so. Or you could have a classic runoff. A classic runoff is simply to say, we will have a runoff election, but instead of just taking the top 2 candidates, we'll take all the candidates and just drop the least popular candidate and have everybody run again. Then drop the least popular candidate and have everybody run again until there are only 2. And then whoever gets the most votes obviously gets 50% or more of the election, right? So here in New York, we have X'd out the first 2. Voters decided they don't want minority rule anymore. That was the question in the charter, essentially. And they decided they don't want martial law. So let's look at the top 2 runoff and then how it's different from the classic runoff. And then we'll see how the classic runoff is identical to ranked choice voting. In a top 2 runoff, you would say, okay, this person didn't get a majority of the votes, but they got the most votes. We want to make sure that there's an opportunity for all of these dissatisfied people to express their opinion. Top 2 runoff eliminates the lowest getting candidates. And you can see here that if you ran the election again, it's possible to get a different outcome. Whereas candidate B won with a plurality, candidate A, if you asked people who voted for candidate C and D who their second choice was, candidate A could win by getting an absolute majority. This means that people had to change their vote. And you can imagine that this blue voter here moved all the way from candidate D to candidate A. But we can also imagine then that they would have been a little bit happier voting for candidate C. This is why the top 2 system is not ideal, because it makes people skip a step. They can't say who their second choice was. They have to say, who is my favorite of the people left, right? So let's explore now the classic runoff, which solves that exact problem. Remember, in our previous version of the top 2 runoff, we immediately eliminated 2 candidates, one candidate which might have been pretty popular. So instead, we will simply eliminate the candidate who got the least number of votes. This, by the way, is what our charter now says. We're going to have an election and eliminate the person with the least votes. That means instead of 2 people going to the next election, 3 people go to the next election. So what does that mean? The voters for D, instead of going all the way to A, can now simply go to C. Now what happens? Well, who have the most votes? It's actually candidates B and C. It's not candidate A and B. So now we have a different outcome than we did with the top 2 election. We have changed the way that the vote happened so that the people who go to the next round are different. As a result, we might have our supporter for candidate A move their votes over to candidate B. Now candidate B wins. So just to be clear, when we did a straight up first past the post election, if we recall, candidate B won and it made everybody unhappy. Then we did a top 2 vote, right? We just took the top 2 and did a runoff election. Candidate A won. But now, because people are allowed to shift their votes through multiple rounds of elections, we've changed the outcome again. But this time, everybody got a little bit closer to who they wanted to win. So, what is ranked choice voting? Ranked choice is the equivalent of the classic runoff, but without actually holding multiple elections. How is this possible? Let's go back to our one voter. Our one voter has to make a decision about who she supports. In this case, we know that Vicky voter has chosen candidate A as her number 1 pick. Now, through our experimentation, we also know that if she can't vote for candidate A, she will vote for candidate B. And that is exactly what we saw happen when we held the classic runoff version. Remember, she moved between all of the different candidates and had her option to go as the dynamics changed over time. So if she can't have A, she goes to B. Now, we didn't do this, but let's say, theoretically speaking, can we imagine Vicky choosing a third choice if B is eliminated? I'd say if we can imagine her choosing another candidate if A is eliminated, we can also imagine her choosing another candidate if B is eliminated. And so she does, C. And we can do this infinitely. Now, New York City only lets you do it up to 5, but as a mathematical concept, it is no different from ranking your candidates and saying, who would I vote for if I lost this candidate? Who would I vote for if I lost the next candidate? Who would I vote for if I lost the third candidate? It is not different in any respect from having 3 elections where the person you voted for was progressively eliminated for not being popular enough. So, voter preference, that's what this is all about. This way, you can rank your candidates, and this is what your ballot will look like. Instead of voting down a line, you will have a grid, and you'll be able to rank people first, second, and third choice, so that you will fill them in the order that you want to see them elected. So, classic runoff is also known as ranked choice, which is also known as instant runoff, because they basically are the exact same mathematical outcome. Now, I just want to stress this. Ranked choice can be counted in several different ways. It doesn't have to be instant runoff. We are using instant runoff in New York City. Now, common questions. What if I only vote for my first choice? This is not a particularly effective strategy because it doesn't help your candidate at all. It simply hurts your capacity to have the person you actually want elected. And let's have a look at this. If your second vote is getting used, it's because your candidate already lost, right? You voted in the first round like everybody else. Let's imagine for a second that there is no runoff. You lost. That's the end of the story. You are given by ranked choice the opportunity to go to another candidate. By not voting for them, you are blocking your capacity to effectively vote in second and third elections. right? But the important part is your candidate was eliminated. Voting for them once doesn't make any difference. They were never going to have enough votes to move to the second round. That's what it means to have a candidate be eliminated. So if you only vote for that one candidate, you would have lost in plurality voting, you would have lost in top two voting, and you're going to lose in ranked choice voting because your candidate would not have gotten enough votes to proceed. All it does is prevent you from participating in the next election. Another common question, is this bad for minorities? This is an argument that comes up a lot. There's a concern, for example, that in a minority community with a plurality, somebody who's not of the dominant group can actually win the election. So if a district, for example, is 40% Asian and you've got 5 people running and 3 of them are white, the Asian candidate might be able to eke out a win using plurality voting, right? This is a very common concern. This is why the NAACP came out against ranked choice. However, this is a really mixed bag. So the concern here, again, is this is emphasizing like, the concern here is that when you have a bunch of minority candidates running, let's say you've got a 60% black district, and you've got 3 black candidates running and 1 white person running, because black people happen to be the majority population, they'll split the vote. They'll split the vote amongst their 3 black candidates, and then the white person will win. So this is the reverse of the argument for why ranked choice voting is bad. So the argument that is said, again, is that, oh, well, a minority candidate can win over multiple white candidates, and that increases minority representation. It increases diversity. But the reverse of that is minority communities are not monoliths. Not all Asians are the same. Not all Latinos are the same. And they will often fracture their own vote, which means that, you know, an outsider or a white candidate might win in a minority district with less than 50% of the vote. And ranked choice can actually resolve this conflict, because even though the Chinese and the Japanese and the Koreans might split their vote for their respective candidates, they could recombine at the end as they each put their second choice and third choice as one of the ethnic minority candidates. And that means that this person would still win with a majority, even in a case when, in a plurality situation, the white candidate would have won. And I happen to have used ethnicity here, but this works for religious groups as well. This works for any constituency that you can think of. Environmentalists, left of center voters, right? Left of center, I think, is maybe one of the most common. Left of center will often field many, many candidates, and then they'll all have their vote dispersed. And then you end up with a centrist candidate or a right of center candidate being the one that's elected, because for whatever reason, folks who are right of center tend to be, to quote, fall in line more often. They have a much more they are naturally inclined towards hierarchical decision making. So in this regard, ranked choice really helps the recombination of people who should be allies with each other, even if what they want to do is spread their votes out at the beginning. It's often referred to as prevents the wasting of votes, which is why people are excited about it in terms of eliminating 2-party systems. But again, now what's happening in New York, because this is in the primary. The last common question I'll address is, what does this do to campaigns? Long story short, it kind of makes them nicer. At least that's what we've seen in other jurisdictions. We can't know for a fact what it's going to do to New York, but it tends to make campaigns nicer, because if I'm a candidate running against another candidate, their voters might put me second, even if they don't put me first. And I want to appeal to all of the voters of my opponents so that I'm in a position to be in second place. Because if nobody gets a win on the first round, those second choice votes are going to come into play. If nobody wins on the second round, those third choice votes are going to come into play. So I want to be as nice as possible to as many groups as possible so that they all put me somewhere in their ranking. This tends to mean that you have to be nicer to other candidates as well. it also tends to mean that ideas become homogenized because everybody who sees a popular idea picks it up from the next candidate, and the differentiation between candidates goes down as everybody tries to appeal to the exact same subset of the population, which is actually the entire population, because now all these votes can be flying around, and you're not going to have your core constituency. You'll have your people who put you first, which you want, because it's great to win on the first round, but you'll hedge by appealing to people outside of your core. So that being said, I know there are lots of questions about ranked choice, and I'm happy to entertain them now. And of course, I'm happy to recap anything I said in case it wasn't clear. I know it's very complicated.
Thank you, Ben. One clarification that a friend of mine who lives in another state mentioned when I invited him to this, he's on my mailing list, is that he comes from Georgia, and he mentioned that if they had ranked choice voting in Georgia, that would have been a very decisive thing in terms of the recent Senate election. And what you're pointing out is this is only in the primary, and it's only in New York City. So this is not dealing with ranked choice voting across party.
Correct. Absolutely. Very important for all of us to keep in mind, because the Democrat is still going to win, and the primary is still the real election. So we should definitely all keep that in mind. Also, I'm happy to answer any other questions about New York City elections and campaign finance, because I've got a wealth of knowledge about that too. So don't feel constrained necessarily to rank choice. But if there's any other questions, hit me with them.
Okay, Johanna has a question in the chat. Johanna, would you like to answer your question?
Hello, thank you. This was fantastic. I said I love the smiley faces because I do. They were fantastic. Yeah, my question is there any conversation around moving to ranked choice voting on the federal level? Like that would, answer a lot of the questions in terms of a push against third-party candidates, the whole Ralph Nader situation.
Yes, there has been conversation around that. Congress actually the states get to decide how Congress is elected, the House and the Senate and their borders, and Congress can decide for the legislature how these folks are elected. So Maine, for example, actually has federal elections using ranked choice voting for the House of Representatives. So that's something that can be done at the state level. And yes, if they wanted to, the feds could implement it nationwide. It's unlikely they'll ever do that though, because ultimately they appeal back to power brokers in their states, and the state, and they happen to have benefited from the certain electoral rules that put them in office. So it's usually deemed unlikely that that Congress will do anything to change the way states have opted to set their electoral processes, but it's completely feasible. And again, there is at least one state that's done it already.
For Maine, is that the general election, or is that for primaries?
That's a general election. They really, they went all out.
Okay, Lisa is next.
Yeah, hi. So is this coming up in our upcoming elections? And if so, like what efforts are being made to educate the public so that everybody doesn't just like freak out?
It is in the June primary, so there's only a few more months until we're going to have to do this for real. Actually, there was a special election that made use of this, I think last month or maybe a few weeks ago. But putting that aside, yes, this will be active for the June primary. And the education efforts, there are a couple of organizations that are going around doing sort of the thing that I'm doing right now. I don't know how good their presentation is. Obviously, I'm open to feedback on my presentation. I only know how good it is if you let me know. So feel free to pass anonymous commentary or even direct commentary to me or to Ida. Here's my information again. But yeah, it is absolutely true that the United States, as a general rule, has done a terrible job with voter engagement, civic education, and all forms of reaching out to the public on how elections work. So, I mean, it's coming up. I don't know. I mean, I know what's being done to prevent people from freaking out. Whether that's going to work is a totally other question. Whether there's enough resources behind it, I would probably say no.
That was actually going to be my question. Is there money behind educating people on this process?
There is, but it really depends on what you consider enough money. And I've seen not so much. I mean, I'm in obviously fairly informed circles, so I'm not the target demographic of the advertisements. But yeah, there's just not there's not a huge, as far as I can tell, campaign being waged in terms of advertising to raise people's awareness about this. There are organizations, again, that are going out to the tried and true community groups to do trainings on this and just hoping to spread it through community organizing. That would have been maybe difficult in normal times, but with the pandemic in particular, a lot of these groups don't meet as much. There's far less interaction between the members of those groups and the general public, just because people see each other less frequently, unless it's a scheduled sort of Zoom meeting or what have you. So the dissemination of that information, I would say, is probably not going so swimmingly, which I know you're recording this, so perhaps it makes sense to just sort of put this on the internet.
Okay, good thought. In terms of feedback, there are some comments in the chat, which I'll share with you, and maybe Lori Greenwald, would you like to echo one of those? And Ben, can you get rid of the PowerPoint so I can see if people are raising their hands, because I can't really see.
Sure thing.
Yeah, okay, thanks. So let's see, is Lori muted? I don't hear her. Okay, so anyone else have questions for Ben about, okay, Sylvia, okay, you're next. You have to unmute.
I did. Well, thank you. Thank you. This is a lot of information. I've been reading a little on social media. And of course, as you said, Democrats seem to control this show. I've been reading that Republicans are interested now in registering as Democrats so that they can have more influence. And I guess they hope to get their points of view and policies to have more effect. Do you think that will affect anything for us?
In New York City, I'm going to say almost certainly not, because the Democrats basically win 90% of the time, or 100, really, you know, somewhere between 90 and 100%. So if you took the average, we're probably like 97, 98% on victory. The number of Republicans that can even mount a challenge it's such a small cohort that they're not going to be moving the needle very much in these in these primary elections. That being said, they might be able to get a little bit of traction going in some of the closer districts, maybe the Upper East Side, for example, which used to be very Republicans used to win there normally, up until just maybe 20 years ago or 15 years ago. And of course, in Staten Island, where they continue to really have a stronghold. But no, I don't think it's going to lead to any real changes in city government. And ultimately, Republicans have known that the system is sort of rigged against them. I don't know about rigged against them, but they really have no voice in city government through the general election, except occasionally for mayor. Think Giuliani, think Bloomberg. So a lot of Republicans already register as Democrats just to participate in the primary if they're savvy. So in New York City, that's not such a big change from the norm.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, Andy, Andy had a question. If you have a question, please, I'm having difficulty seeing if your hand is raised. Please use the electronic hand raise if possible, or put it in the chat.
I was wondering, how was ranked choice voting decided upon? Was it voted on? Or
Yes.
It was.
So there were two last year? Nope, 2 years ago now. Wow, man, time flies. 2 years ago, there were two different charter review commissions put together by the city government. Basically, the mayor was like, well, actually, one of the borough presidents and the city council were like, we want to do a charter revision commission. And the mayor was like, I'm doing one. So then Bill de Blasio did one, which did not include ranked choice voting. It was a bunch of mainly platitudinal things, such as the creation of the new Civic Engagement Commission, which I don't know where they are at. They should be doing something about this. So that made three changes to the charter that were not necessarily so substantive, but all of those things passed. And then a few months later, the City Council Review Commission launched, and that was a comprehensive review of the entire city charter. And as part of that package, all of which passed, ranked choice voting was put to the voters in a referendum. And so, it's very easy to have missed it because there were two referenda. One was the mayor, one was the city council. They were in two subsequent elections. There were like 3 referenda on the first one and like 7 on the second one. So, I did a bunch of talks about those charter revisions and what was going to be on those ballots, but it was a lot. And yeah, this ultimately was passed by the voters, but one could be forgiven for sure for having missed that.
Thank you.
Ben, you came to Let's Talk Democracy when we were at the library to talk to us about the charter revision. And I remember that as being a very helpful laying out of exactly what we were going to be voting for. So I appreciate your coming for that. Michelle is next.
Hi, Ben. Good to
Hi.
have you.
Thanks.
I was just thinking that with all that's going on now, this new ranking voting and all the stuff going on with de Blasio and the pandemic and then Cuomo and his mishigas. I love that word as a Shiksa. I just always love that word. Where do you see things headed in the upcoming mayoral election?
Oh, wow. All right. So I will say, this is quite difficult to prognostication is always hard. Seeing the future is.
You'd make a lot of money if you can really see the future.
I should bet. Listen, if I were going to put money on anything right now, if you made me, Andrew Yang is ahead in the polls. He's consistently ahead in the polls. He's ahead in the polls because he has much higher name recognition than the other candidates, having run for president, and almost all of his publicity is good publicity. I happen to have, seen several policy proposals of his that I think are terrible. But what are you going to do, I suppose? He is, there's a feeling amongst sort of the political insiders that it would be very difficult for somebody to beat him at this point, just because of that name recognition, the lack of political baggage, and lack of negative track record, and just the fact that voters aren't really necessarily going to pay attention until later. And can another candidate make enough inroads quickly enough, given that June is coming up quickly? We're almost in April. That being said, other key candidates are Eric Adams. He's borough president of Brooklyn. I mentioned Adams in particular because borough presidents start with one of the largest possible constituencies in the city, which is to say they've been elected by an entire borough. Eric Adams also happens to be African American at a time of high concern over social criminal justice for Black and brown communities, and he's also a former police officer. Now that cuts both ways, given what I just said, but there's definitely an argument to be made, and people are making the argument that it puts him in a unique position to bring reform to the NYPD as a former person on the inside of that organization. Some other really, key folks, Scott Stringer, who's the current comptroller of New York City, is running. Again, he's a citywide elected. He comes from the best possible perch in theory to run for another citywide office. Aside, the only other one would be public advocate. Now, public advocate has been a consistent launching pad for mayor. Bill de Blasio was public advocate. Tish James was public advocate, and it was, she was a very likely candidate and front runner for mayor until she became Attorney General of the state. And then there's a bunch of other candidates who are really out there proving themselves, such as Catherine Garcia, who was former head of sanitation, Diane Morales, who is a super progressive candidate who comes from a very large nonprofit management background. She founded and managed one of the bigger nonprofits in the United States. And so there's all of these, I don't mean to be biased. There's something like 11 candidates running. I don't have them all off the top of my head. All I can really say is that Yang is the front runner. It's sort of his to lose. As from what I can tell, Adams is second. And then it's really up to the other candidates to do something dynamic and put together a coalition that will win, maybe not in the first round, but the second or third round. Now, even for a position like mayor, with 11 candidates, all of those rounds matter tremendously. People might think mayor's a big office, everybody's gonna vote and it's gonna be decided lickety split within the first round or the first 2 rounds. This is not the case. Let's say Andrew Yang does get 21% of the vote or whatever it is. He has not won that election. That means that all of the other candidates are going to rapidly find that they're being eliminated. But it is easy to imagine that all of these smaller candidates all stack up behind another one of the smaller candidates. So like all of the progressive ones find that all of their votes, move to Diane Morales, who's like the most progressive candidate in the race. And then she ends up winning after 8 rounds of voting. That all happened instantaneously, but after 8 rounds of voting. And I just want to throw that's why it's so difficult to predict what's going to happen. I just want to throw this out there. My favorite example of ranked choice voting is Abraham Lincoln. Now, there was no ranked choice voting back in 1863 or 4 when he won the Republican nomination. But conventions notoriously do not do first past the post voting. They are a majoritarian system. They, as a result, there were multiple rounds of voting. And Abraham Lincoln was nobody's first choice. He was also nobody's second choice. He was nobody's third choice. He wasn't even anybody's 4th choice. Abraham Lincoln went in there and was like, listen, if you don't like Salmon Chase, vote for me. If you don't like Seward, vote for me. These were luminaries, like really, really popular people. The odds of Abraham Lincoln becoming the Republican nominee, very low. But he wins on like the 5th ballot. So that's how volatile these situations can be. And so seeing the future, it's difficult. It's hard. Andrew Yang ain't gonna win with 21% of the vote, I'll tell you that much.
Well, I think your point is well taken about branding, because right now the airwaves are so full of other stories that honestly, I see these candidates in the advertising, I have no idea who they are. Whereas Yang, I know because I saw him all throughout the presidential election. The one thing about Yang, though, is that he's not from around here. He's not a New Yorker, right?
I mean, this is one common argument, but obviously there's 8 million people to convince of it.
We'll see. I guess we'll see. So we'll see. We'll have another session with you after the election. We'll see how good you did.
I would love, obviously, I'm happy to come back anytime I'm invited.
Thanks, Ben.
With the way that pollsters have been doing during our other types of elections, I wouldn't want to put you in that position, Ben, of having to predict. Anyway, Sheldon, I know has a question.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you now.
So the Abraham Lincoln example, that was in 1860, not 1860.
1860. Right. Sorry.
It was the second election that a Republican candidate for president was in. The first one was in 1856. And
here's a guy who knows his stuff.
John Fremont, who lost. But to get to back to this election, I think Andrew Yang is in, although he's got name recognition, and you accurately, I think, put your finger on the number of votes he might get in this primary. I think there's an upper limit to the number of votes he's going to garner. He's as we said, he's got this attraction because of having run for president. But if you look at his offerings, they're really thin, and then anything but traditional Democratic offerings. So I would not put a lot of faith in his strength, especially in ranked choice voting, because with ranked choice voting, I believe that one or two other candidates will rise to the top and eclipse him. As you mentioned, Eric Adams, and don't knock Scott Stringer. It was just a program the other night on New York One, in which they pointed out that Scott Stringer's mom, who just recently died from COVID, her second marriage was to a Puerto Rican man. So Scott Stringer appeals across two important ethnic groups, to Jews and to Puerto Ricans. So he's got some real interesting attributes. And also he is very knowledgeable about city government, which is not true for everyone. It is true for Catherine Garcia and to some degree Maya Wiley, but he can really put that laurel in his cap. So I just caution everyone to be a little wary of buying onto the idea that Andrew Yang has got is the winner already.
Certainly, I tried to be impartial. All I can say is Andrew is up in the polls.
Yeah.
Obviously, I've got my own opinions on who I like, but that's not the topic of conversation. Certainly, listen to this man. He knows there's no shoo-in until there's a winner.
Exactly.
What role does money have in terms of Andrew Yang? He's obviously got plenty of money. And you mentioned about the way that the tables are leveled in the city elections. I'm wondering about that. And also, he does speak to me because he's against scaffolding.
Sure. So I guess insofar as money, Andrew Yang has opted in to matching funds, as far as I know. And so he'll basically, now, matching funds doesn't perfectly level the playing field because you can still raise outside money. So there is that to consider. And you have to be able to max out your matching funds to take advantage. Basically everybody's trying to hit the same cap, but not everybody will hit the cap. So Andrew Yang's fundraising is strong, as far as I know. He's qualified for matching funds, which means he's raised a minimum amount of money. So he will be competing on a relatively level playing field with other candidates who accept matching funds. So that puts him in a pretty strong position insofar as vis-a-vis other candidates. I do know that Ray McGuire, for example, who is a black guy who is sort of like the new Michael Bloomberg. He's a Wall Streeter. He's not, and I say he's like Michael Bloomberg because he has opted not to take matching funds, and he will be able to raise and spend, basically however much money he wants. However much money he can raise, he can spend it. There is a cap of about $7.7 or $8 million for a citywide election for mayor in matching funds. You can't spend more than that. If Ray wants to, he'll be able to raise and spend $100 million, just like Bloomberg did, or if he's capable of doing it. Maybe he can't get $100 million, but he's got the right to do it because he's not using the matching fund system. I forget what the other part of your question was. Although he is,
it was about scaffolding, which is a separate issue. Actually, somebody's putting in the chat, what do you know about scaffolding? Why is there so much scaffolding around it? Andrew Yang, for some reason, has actually come out against scaffolding.
Yeah, the reason there's so much scaffolding around is because there's a scaffolding law that requires a building that is of a certain age, that's gone a certain amount of time since its last city mandated upkeep, to basically put scaffolding around the building, and then you pay a fine for the scaffolding. But for large buildings, it can be cheaper for the landowner to pay a continuous built-in monthly fee or annual fee for the scaffolding. It can be cheaper to do that than to do the repointing of the brick and all of the other maintenance things that need to get done. That doesn't mean that the building is unsafe. Lots of safe buildings have scaffolding around them. It is arguable, like whether or not the scaffolding law really needs to exist for the safety of New Yorkers. Certainly you want to have these mandated upkeep, but like whether it's the right time frame is maybe a question. Anyway, that's sort of why scaffolding exists, because it's a cost play for building owners. And then, you know, the building owners obviously plead poverty. Oh, it cost me so much to do this. I don't have the budget to reface my entire building. So I can't even afford to do it. I have to just put the scaffolding up. So obviously then revenue lobbies for tax breaks and such for apartment owner, like building owners, but you know, it's that's the reason.
We're coming close to the end of time, and I see Sheldon's hand up. I'm going to ask.
I just want to,
Wait, Sheldon, hold on a second. I just want to ask too, if you happen to know anything about district, I think we're in District 29, the Forest Hills, where you go Park, Kew Gardens race, if you know anything about that. And Sheldon had a question too.
Who's running in 29?
Yeah.
Do you know? Oh, I don't. Who's the incumbent? Who's the current?
Karen Koslowitz.
Koslowitz. Okay. So I only know one person who's running for that. And now Ed something.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right. And actually I met him through you. So I'm not so tied in to that race right now. I do know that he's running though. And I know that it's a hotly contested race. Like there's a lot of folks running in that district. But I'm sorry, I don't have keen insights into that. For next time, perhaps I'll look into it.
Sheldon, I'm sorry I cut you off.
so I just wanted to clarify. It's not scaffolding that what Ben was talking about. It's what's called a shed over the sidewalk and around the facade of the building. The building law requires the facade to be inspected every 5 years and repairs to be done. So it's cheaper, as Ben was pointing out, to install the shed as a permanent fixture, temporary fixture, and leave it in place rather than to go fix the facade. The shed is the what looks like scaffolding. It's the wood platform that's supported on scaffolding that only goes up to, say, the first or second story to catch any debris that might fall off the building lands on the shed. So it's not really, they're not going up 20 stories because to erect a 20-story scaffold is expensive.
Right.
To put up a shed is relatively less expensive.
Well, I know that there's sheds in front of large buildings, and
Yes.
how this is supposed to protect the passerby if something falls off the building is really questionable. I guess my question to you, Ben, can our elected official to the city council do anything about this situation?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There was actually a city council member, Ben Kalos, who introduced legislation before about this. It just didn't go anywhere. I'm not necessarily sure on the reasons why, but it's completely possible to change that law. You could eliminate the requirement for the shed. You could eliminate the requirement for the upkeep. I probably wouldn't recommend that. But yes, that law can certainly be changed by whoever. It can be changed by the city council, and your city council member could be an advocate for that.
Okay, thanks. Unless there are other questions, I think we're going to call it a night. Ben, I really thank you for making this very murky topic quite a bit clearer, at least for me. And you should take a look at some of the comments in the chat, which are very complimentary to your style and your ability to explain things complete with the smiley faces.
I will. I really appreciate that. I'm certainly going to do that. Maybe I'll take some screenshots since they'll disappear after you close the Zoom.
Okay, thanks so much, and looking forward to seeing you again. So everybody, plan on voting June 22nd, right? That's the day, right? June 22nd. Thank you all for coming. And have a
Thanks. See you all later.